If you've been on Facebook very long at a time, you've probably run across an ad that has come across your news feed that maybe has a picture of a peaceful cabin out in the middle of a wood somewhere, and you think to yourself, that's a beautiful place. And the caption may read something like, uh, "This could be yours if you're willing to not watch football for the rest of your life." Or if you're willing to live in this place by yourself for a year, you could have $1 million. Are you willing to do so? Now, for some of us, we may stop and look at that particular picture and we'll think to ourselves, that sounds like a pretty good deal. Because we don't necessarily like football. We like to be out by ourselves and we like the beautiful things in nature. And perhaps, we don't have $1 million. And so we think, that would be a pretty good deal. But for others, these fishing ads don't even produce an inkling of interest because maybe they like or love the city and they love to be around people and they love to be around the things that people have done. For others, they like football too much. And still for others, perhaps they have millions of dollars. And so one more million just really doesn't mean that much to them. We think about the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, meaning that each person decides or evaluates beauty based upon his own experiences and the things that he appreciates in life. Well, good news is in the ear of the hearer, if you will. One determines whether or not something that he has heard is good news based upon his experiences and his perspective of life. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. That's Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. This concise statement summarizes Paul's thesis of his letter to the Romans. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. The word gospel means good news, for it is the power of God for salvation. That's the substance of the good news. To everyone who believes, that's the recipients, the hearers. To the Jew first, and also to the Greeks. The good news, the gospel, is for everyone in the world, and that's what Paul is trying to get across to the Roman brethren as he writes to them. But Paul knew that not everyone would consider the gospel good news. He understood that not everyone wants to be with God, that is, to live in the cabin, if you will. And not everyone feels a need for salvation, that is, feels the need for the $1 million, if you will. You see, Paul understood that some Jews thought that they were automatically right with God simply due to their ancestry. They thought that because they were born Jews and could trace their lineage back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that they were automatically right with God. Paul knew that some thought that they were automatically right with God or in a relationship with God because they had the law that God had given unto them, and they had the custom of circumcision, the sign of the covenant, and they were keeping the law pretty good, and they had been circumcised at the proper time. And so they felt like, they were fine with God. They didn't need salvation. They didn't feel like they were lost. Most of the Greeks during that time, and which, by the way, stood for the Gentiles, you were either divided up into Jew or Gentile, or Jew or Greek, the way it would be read within the New Testament or meant within the New Testament. Well, most of the Greeks or the Gentiles had totally corrupted God's uniqueness and his divine qualities by developing a mythological system arising from their own vivid imaginations and fears. Some of the Jews had followed in the Gentiles' steps, turning God into whatever likeness they chose because they just simply could not accept God for who he was. Paul knew that for these people to deem the gospel to be good news of salvation, they had to be convinced and convicted that they were lost in their sins, separated from God, facing the wrath of the one true living creator of all mankind. And so that's the reason that immediately after stating, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek," he would say, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Now, this is why the gospel is good news, because the same God who is loving and kind is also wrathful. And we can be away from God, lost, if you will, in our relationship with God, facing his wrath. The gospel is good news because it offers salvation. So when Paul makes that statement, "For the wrath of God has come upon these people," this is the thesis statement for why salvation by God should excite us. It's why the letter, which contains the word gospel 11 times, and faith 35 plus times, and grace 18 times, and righteous or righteousness 30 plus times, also contains the word wrath in reference to God 10 times or better. He needed to convince them, he needed to convict them that all mankind needs Jesus Christ and the salvation that he offers as he reconciles us back to God. I welcome you to this lesson. I thank you for logging in to be with us. We're striving to study the book of Romans each Thursday night at 7 o'clock, and we'd love to have you to join us each time. Last week we did study, or a couple of weeks ago actually, we did study Paul's statement about, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." In this lesson, we'll learn what mankind does to incur the wrath of God and the most devastating degree of God's wrath that one can experience while here on this earth. And it may not be what you think it is. Let's read together Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy and murder and strife and deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decrees that those who practice such things deserve to die, They not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. From this passage, I want us to learn or to draw two main points. And the first one is God's wrath comes when man suppresses the truth. God's wrath comes when man suppresses the truth. Now, I want us to define a few words here from that first passage there. And this will be coming from the Strong's Expanded Dictionary of Bible Words. The word wrath, the Greek word is orge, and it means an excitement of the mind, a violent passion, justifiable abhorrence. It's deeper and more emotional, perhaps longer than anger. It's a total abhorrence for what's going on in mankind. The word ungodliness, asaibia, means a disregard or defiance of God's person as creator and ruler of the world. It's not that you necessarily go against God's decrees or his laws. Now, that's true. That's what happens whenever you have this ungodliness that he's talking about. But this is more of a disregard or defiance of the person of God as the creator and ruler of the world. I just don't want him to be my God. I just don't want him to be the Lord. I don't want to have to be responsible to him. And so there's ungodliness. Unrighteousness, adikaia, means a condition of not being right according to God's standard of holiness and righteousness. It's moral wrongfulness of character and life and or action. And through these things we find that the wrath of God comes because man suppresses, kateko, to hold down, to hold fast, that is to grab hold of something and hold fast of it in order to hinder the course or progress of something or someone. It's like whenever someone is perhaps running a race and they're about to beat the one that you like, so you run out and you grab them and you hold them to keep them from winning the race. Well, that's what you do when you suppress the truth. These people restrain the spread of truth by their unrighteousness. I think whenever I read this about Matthew chapter 23 and verse 13, where that Jesus was talking about the Pharisees, and he would say, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who enter or who would enter to go in." You suppress the truth is basically what he's saying. And you know, this world that we live in plainly demonstrates God's existence and his power. That's what Paul states here in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. He says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." The psalmist would put this way in Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4, the first part of verse 4. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." The psalmist was saying every day that you live, you can look out and you can see, as Paul would say, the divine nature of God and the power of God simply by looking at the things that are in this world. There are so many different things that indicate a divine being created this world. The laws of nature, the stability of certain aspects of nature, where that man can predict certain things to happen years in advance, the complexity of our bodies. I want to share just a little bit of that information with you concerning the telescopic type of view of the world. The Milky Way is estimated to be 100,000 light years across. Now, 1 light year is equal to 6 trillion miles. And the Milky Way is estimated to be 100,000 of those. Our solar system is traveling at about 45,000 miles per hour within that Milky Way. It's kind of fast, isn't it? In our solar system, the Earth travels a 584 million mile elliptical orbit around the Sun at a rate of about 67,000 miles per hour, all the while spinning on its axis at 1,000 miles per hour. And yet it's said that the Earth veers from a straight line exactly 1/9 of an inch every 18 miles. That is every second. If it veered 1/10 of an inch, we would burn up. If it veered 1/8 of an inch, we would freeze because we'd get too far away from the sun. And yet with all of this speed, with all of this vastness, with all the possible things that could go wrong, mankind can predict hundreds of years in advance, many years in advance at least, down to the minute or possibly even the second when the sun's going to come up each day. The location and time of lunar and solar eclipses, the appearance of comets, and the different lunar stages. Mankind can develop a space program which involves minute calculations for rendezvous between rockets and heavenly bodies, or rockets and a space station that's been placed within the Earth, within the orbit. They can predict or they can calculate workable angles for re-entry of our rockets or our shuttles. They can calculate gravitational pull and needed thrust to overcome the gravitational forces of the Earth. All of this because everything is so stable. And all of that seems like you're just barreling out of control, there are fixed laws, and there are fixed routes, and there are fixed things that we can calculate so that many years in advance we can know these things. On the microscopic level, the body of an average adult is composed of 10 trillion cells. Now, some say as many as 37.2 trillion cells. I don't know how many there are, but there's a bunch of them to say the least. Each cell contains about 6 feet of DNA, enough that if all the DNA within your body was laid end to end, it said that it would reach to Pluto and back. The code contained in one person's DNA genome would fill 3,000 books, each having 1,000 pages, and each page containing 1,000 letters. It's a lot of coding, to say the least. At this time, only 2.5% of the human genome is understood. And each cell's DNA contains the same code as every other human being. Thus, scientists can determine that it came from a human being. Yet there is a variation of that code, which makes every person unique and allows scientists to determine the person of origin for any given cell. And that cell contains enough variation of the code to determine what type of cell it is and what function it performs, whether it's a liver cell or heart or lung or skin cell. Now think about that for just a moment. Think about all of the evidence that shows that God planned this. It's out there. All you got to do is look for it and think about it. And you see that a creator, a designer, had to have designed this world. And yet man has always had to battle his pride in refusing to acknowledge God as God, and in wanting to be equal with God in wisdom, and in wanting to bring God down to his level, or in completely denying God's existence. From the time of the Garden of Eden, that's exactly what happened to Adam and Eve. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to be equal with God. They wanted God to be down on their level, or them to be up on his level. They just didn't want God to be God. Romans 1:21 through 23. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds and animals and creeping things. Verse 24, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. That's the problem with mankind. Exchanging the truth of God for a lie. Knowing that there is a God, but not wanting to honor him as God or give thanks to him. Professing ourselves to be wise based upon using the things that God has given to us, the very tools and the intelligence that God has given unto us, and saying, well, that's ours. We did that. And it just happened. And then becoming very unrighteous, ungodly, and in doing so, suppressing the truth. God's wrath comes when man suppresses the truth. And the ultimate extent of God's wrath, God gave them up. Stated 3 different times in our passage. God gave them up. Now, I entitled the lesson, The Times When God Surrendered. Well, that word God gave them up means to surrender up. God surrendered them up. He delivered them over to reap the consequences of their own actions. And this is something that has been going on from the beginning of time, both for the Jews and the Gentiles. God would reach out and he would try to reveal himself to the people, and he would try to show them and to tell them the truth about him and what he wanted them to do. And maybe they would do it for a while, but then there would be another generation that came along and they would suppress the truth, turning God into the image of things that we see in nature, and worshiping the creature rather than the Creator, themselves rather than the one who made them, and thinking in terms of how to fulfill the lusts of the body. So we find that God surrendered them up, let them have what they wanted. He continues to do the same today. If you really read Leviticus chapter 26, and this is something I've just recently been reading, so it kind of excited me whenever I saw it. But starting with verse 14, God would describe his discipline of Israel as he told them what he would do to them if they turned their backs on him, if they walked contrary to him. And he goes about it in 3 different stages. The first one is kind of like God saying, okay, I'm going to put you in timeout. I'm going to put you over in the corner, and I'm going to do these things to you in order to try to bring you back to me. Now, if you continue to walk contrary with me, I'm going to spank you, if you will. I'm going to do more things that are more severe in order to try to discipline you, to bring you back. And then the third thing, verse 28 of chapter 26 of Leviticus. If you continue to walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury. And he would tell how that more or less he would give them up. He would just let them go. You know, you think about that whenever you think about a parent and how that a parent will do so much to try to help their children, his children or her children, to develop into mature, good human beings. And they would try their best to discipline them. But sometimes there comes a time whenever they just have to say, you got to go. Until you decide that you're going to abide by what I want you to do and recognize me as the parent, you got to go. You got to get out of here. And that's extreme. That's the absolute extreme. And no parent wants to do that. But sometimes it has to happen. That's what happens. And that's what Paul is describing as far as God is concerned. He would say something similar to it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. He said, "The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth, so be saved." Now, did you notice that? They refused to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. There comes a time whenever God said, if that's what you want, I'm going to give it to you. And I'm going to give it to you to such a degree that you won't even be able to recognize the truth. You won't even be able to accept the truth because you've pushed it too far. In Romans, Paul would say God gave them up in the lusts of their minds and the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. You know, it seems that whenever we step away from God and we really do away with our respect for the person of God and we start serving ourselves, one of the first things that is involved in is a dishonoring of our bodies, in that we start fulfilling those lusts that we have in our lives in any way that we feel like we want to. And so we find that God gave them up for that. And then it goes further, verses 26 and 27. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For the women exercise or exchange natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. I don't know of any other way of taking that other than saying that when we practice homosexuality, if we ever practice homosexuality, we choose to do so, we are suppressing the truth. And it is a shame that we do those types of acts. It's a way of God saying, if that's what you want, you got it. Here it is. But there's going to come a time when you're going to have to pay the penalty. And then in verses 28 and 31, the third time that he would say, and God gave them up. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness and evil and covetousness and malice. They are full of envy and murder and strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. Paul, in turning immediately to an attempt to explain why the gospel is such good news, seems to be telling the Roman brethren, all you have to do is look back at your history, and you don't have to look that far. Whether you're a Jew or Gentile, in your ancestry, you'll see people who denied God, who suppressed the truth, who proudly worshiped the creature more than the Creator. And you'll also see evidence that God surrendered. He gave up your ancestors to their own lusts and their base desires. And then it's as if he's saying, look around you today. You're living in the city of Rome, where all of these idol temples are, where that the worship is based upon sexual desires and lusts. You see all of this. Now, ask yourself, has God given us up? Has God given us up to the point that I myself am being surrendered over by God because I'm involved in these things? As we think about those things today, We can look out and we can see much of the same things that were going on in Rome at that time happening in our world today. And it matters not which country we live in, we can see these things. Paul would tell us today the same thing that he told them, as he's trying his best to impress upon them their need for the gospel, for the salvation that comes with the gospel. He would say, for the wrath of God is being poured out on those who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness and ungodliness. But let me tell you, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. That's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus. I'm not ashamed of that. For it's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, to all of mankind. That's the first message of Paul's exhortation, of his trying to explain why the gospel is such good news. And I hope that you'll continue with us as we study more of what Paul says, or why Paul says this is why you need the gospel. This is why the gospel is such good news. And then I hope you'll continue with us as we talk about what that good news is. Thank you, and I hope that you'll be back with us next week.